Chinese were urinating on their sacred texts. They used to put the lamas in the pits and urinate on them. How many of us know that for the last 5 years, China has stopped all Indian pilgrims from visiting the most sacred Kailash Mansarovar region? In June 1950, Mao Zedong passed an order for the military occupation of Tibet. Sardar Patel warned Pandit Nehru. When General Sir Roy Butcher had gone to Nehru, Nehru had told him, "General, I don't need an army. I just need the police." Chinese army was ruthless. It relentlessly committed genocide. 1 million Tibetans were killed. Now China is interfering in Nepal, China is interfering in the Maldives, it is trying to surround India by a string of pearls. The question is it time for India to play the Tibet card? I think the time has come. On 15th August 1947, India became independent. The communist regime took charge in China in 1949. The very next year, in June 1950, Mao Zedong, the chairman of the People's Republic of China, passed an order for the military occupation of Tibet. Tibet till then had been one of the primary buffer zones of the British Indian Empire. It wanted to keep China at bay and it wanted to keep Russia at bay. So there was one buffer zone in Afghanistan where we played the great game, and the second buffer zone was in Tibet, which was kept demilitarized, which was a very peaceful, non-violent Buddhist country where the Dalai Lama ruled. Half the population were monks. Monks devoted to ahimsa, prayers and meditation. But they paid a major price, a tragic price for their peaceful ways. Let's not forget that Tibet once was a very warlike country. Under the king Songtsen Gampo, also called Gesar of Ling, Tibet had captured large swathes of China, Mongolia, and then Songtsen Gampo had 2 wives. One was Chinese, the other was Indian, and she was Buddhist, and she converted her husband to Buddhism, and that's how Tibet became, from a warlike country, a very peaceful Buddhist country. And it paid a tragic price. Like I said, in June 1950, Mao Zedong ordered the conquest and occupation of Tibet, the snuffing out of its independence. Field Marshal Liu Bo-Zheng, the commander of the 2nd Field Army, was given this task. He was called the One-Eyed Dragon, was one of the most combat experienced generals of the People's Liberation Army of China, right? And he, his 2nd Corps was given this task, and they advanced into the Kham, eastern Kham, Amdo, Chang, that particular area. The Tibetan army was mostly a ceremonial army, was armed with muskets and matchlock flintlocks. It was just not any match for the People's Liberation Army of China, which had prevailed in over a 30 years plus, no holds barred civil war with the Kuomintang, and then it had taken on the Americans in Korea and fought them to a standstill. It was a strong army, a mighty army, combat tested. So, they captured the whole of East, Kham, and then there were talks held, and, the Tibetan officials who were sent there, they became quislings, and they signed a 17-point agreement with the Chinese, which virtually bartered away Tibet's sovereignty. They had no right to, no locus standi to. They had not taken the clearance of the Dalai Lama. It was a hoax. That China has a claim on Tibet, I'm afraid, is not borne out by historical fact. Is not borne out by historical fact. They were off and on, kind of a seesaw relationship between China and Tibet. Whenever China was strong, it tried to impose its suzerainty on Tibet. And whenever Tibet was strong and the Chinese center weakened, the Tibetans more or less declared their independence, and they were de facto an independent state. This 17-point agreement was a farce. It had no locus standi because it had not been approved by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the head of state of Tibet. Whatever be the fact, they agreed to, those quislings signed an agreement with China for a peaceful, takeover of Tibet. And with great fanfare, the Chinese army marched into Tibet. Now, let's not forget that India had an embassy in Lhasa. India had trading outposts and military garrisons in Shigatse, some military elements in Lhasa itself, radio detachments and the rest of it. General Sir Francis Tucker, who was at one point of time the GOC Eastern Command of the British Indian Army, had drawn up contingency plans on what to do if China marches into Tibet. Those plans existed, but those files were locked up somewhere. We then had a very pacific leader in Pandit Nehru, who decided that India and China were great Asian powers and they must be friends. He wanted to befriend China, he wanted to reassure China, and in the bargain, Nehru went to the extent of offering India's seat in the UN Security Council, which people wanted to give to India. He said China deserves it better. And we've spent the rest 75 years of our independent life trying to get back into the UN Security Council, and it is now China to whom this seat had been bequeathed by Nehru, which is now resisting India's entry into the UN Security Council. Such are the facts of life. A very far-sighted Sardar Patel had then, in a written communication, warned Pandit Nehru that there was a paradigm shift in India's national security scenario with the incursion, with the occupation of Tibet by the People's Liberation Army of China. Previously, as he pointed out, that we were only looking towards the west. Now we had to look to the north and the west, towards Pakistan and towards China. We had no infrastructure in that area. And he had very presciently said then, we need to create that infrastructure. Unfortunately, that infrastructure is being created now, 75 years after independence. What should have been done at the outset of independence? We should have secured our national frontiers like China had secured its. India just failed to do that. We relied on charisma, goodwill, and peace and ahimsa rhetoric, and that was tragic. It is said that when General Sir Roy Butcher, the first British chief of the Indian Army, had gone to Nehru with plans for the modernization and expansion of the Indian Army, Nehru had told him, "General, I don't need an army. I just need the police. The army is a waste of money. Which country in its right mind would attack peaceful, non-violent, ahinsatmak India, which says so much, goes by the principles of Panchashil? No country in its right mind will ever attack India." Famous last words. China attacked India in 1962, and the rest, they say, is history. Now we had a severe problem. Revolts had broken out in the Kham in 1956 itself. Very serious revolts. The CIA, via Bangladesh, had then supported these revolts, recruited the Khampa guerrillas, trained them in Camp Hale, Colorado, in parachuted them back into the Lokha province, and for a long time these Tibetan guerrillas had given the Chinese army a run for its money. But the Chinese army was ruthless in suppressing the Tibetans. It relentlessly committed genocide. 1 million Tibetans were killed. You know, so many troops were pumped into Tibet that fragile economy collapsed. They could not sustain even the Tibetan population with difficulty. They had to import food grains from India and elsewhere, and that economy collapsed because of the large Chinese armies that were brought in to crush that rebellion. They bombed the monasteries of Litang, whose monks had risen in revolt because the Chinese were urinating on their sacred texts. They used to put the lamas in the pits and urinate on them, ride them like horses, humiliate them. They then killed the poor lamas who had risen up in revolt in the Litang monastery. They bombed that monastery, they used artillery, they used tanks in a ruthless suppression, so-called bandit suppression campaigns. They raped the nuns, and Tibet was in dire straits. They were wanting to arrest the Dalai Lama when the Khampa guerrillas whisked him out of Lhasa and brought him to India. And about 70,000 Tibetan refugees came to India to escape that slaughter, that genocide. Thank God, because they have been able to preserve their language, their culture in Dharamshala. And another 30,000 are spread, diaspora is spread all over the world. It is this diaspora that has saved the Tibetan culture, because the Chinese tried to stamp out the Tibetan language, the Tibetan culture, the Tibetan Buddhist peaceful religion. That is the tragedy of Tibet. The Khampa revolt lasted sometimes till 1975. They shifted their base of operations to Mustang in Nepal, and from there they used to carry out interdiction of the Lhasa-Xinjiang highway, and from there they had some ambushes from where they had intelligence windfall. But then the Americans started leaning towards China. Henry Kissinger and Nixon decided to lean towards China, wean it away from the Soviet Union, and the entire Tibetan enterprise they brought to an inglorious end. The Tibetans were left to fend for themselves, to face the wrath and fury of the Chinese all alone. And they suffered heavily in the Cultural Revolution. Their monasteries were destroyed, their thankas were burnt, their statues were defaced. Very brutal crackdown and suppression, a mindless destruction of a culture. But the fact of the matter is, India did not contest. We did not contest the Chinese occupation of Tibet. We could certainly have delayed it. We could certainly have put up resistance. We could certainly have spoken up for the Tibetans in the world councils. We were more eager to speak up for China. In this short-sightedness, we have invited serious national security problems for ourselves. But Tibet remains the soft underbelly of China. Things are now changing. The Dalai Lama had lost all hope. They had settled down to trying to get a peaceful negotiations with China, but China called Dalai Lama the renegade, the great splittist, and all other choicest of abusive languages. His Holiness is now aging. He is about to touch 90 next year, and there are fears about his health and what will happen once he passes away. Because then the Chinese will try and impose their choice of the Dalai Lama onto the rest, onto Tibet and onto the world. But like I said, things are changing. The United States passed a resolution of Tibet Act, which has just been passed by the United States Congress, which says that the issue of Tibet's amalgamation with China has not been resolved. The Chinese claims on Tibet, on sovereignty over Tibet, are fraudulent. They are not borne out by history. And the United States Act of Congress now questions the legitimacy of the Chinese occupation and suppression of Tibet. a bipartisan Congress delegation very recently visited the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, in Dharamshala. It was a bipartisan delegation. They were Democrat. It was led by Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the Senate, and there were Republican members too. And they met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They also met Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This was something new because previously India had distanced itself from all American overtures towards Tibet for the sake of not annoying China. China has gone out of way to not just annoy us but to cause us severe problems. It armed Pakistan, it gave them nuclear weapons, the blueprints, the designs, the uranium for the first 4 bombs, the M9, M11 missiles, till the Americans were forced to impose sanctions, put it in touch with North Korea, from where they got the Nodong and Taipodong missiles in exchange for giving the nuclear bomb blueprints to North Korea. They encouraged Pakistan to become a pain in the neck for India via terrorism, which it has pursued asymmetric warfare policies for 30 years. Now China is interfering in Nepal, China is interfering in the Maldives, China is interfering in Sri Lanka, China is interfering in Myanmar. It is trying to surround India by a string of pearls. It is trying to do everything it can do to harm India's geopolitical interests in any which way it can. And in 2020, we had an armed clash. The Chinese drew blood for the first time in 2020 in Galwan. That was after decades. It's another matter that they got it right back and they have been given kind of a bloody nose, but it has not been sufficient to try and deter China. We will have to do a lot more if we wish to deter an overly aggressive, overly truculent China trying to throw its weight around in the whole of Asia. Look at the way it's throwing its weight against Taiwan, against Philippines, against Vietnam, against all the small nations in its periphery. It is trying its wolf warrior diplomacy, so-called, and been trying to assert its military might all over the region. The simple fact is that if the United States wishes to contain China, wishes to contain its aggression and its truculence, then there are only 2 countries in Asia which can stand up to China in terms of geopolitical weight, in terms of national security capacity and capability: India and Japan. That was the rationale of the Quad. Now the gloves are off after a lot of bonhomie in which the United States paid for the economic modernization of China, which in turn fueled the military modernization of China. The United States has realized that it could not turn China around into a democratic country by capitalizing its economy. The Chinese have retained their communist autocratic model, but they have liberalized their economy, made it a capitalistic economy, and today they are the second largest economy in the world and a significant threat to the United States of America itself. America has funded the rise of its own geopolitical greatest rival. They seem to have realized their mistake and are now making amends. That is why America is playing the Tibet cards. The question is it time for India to play the Tibet card? I think the time has come. It's long overdue that we played both the T cards, Tibet, Taiwan. If China can arm Pakistan, if China can make it a nuclear power, if China can encourage it to wage asymmetric war against India for 30 years, we can pay it back in the same coin by helping Taiwan, by helping the Philippines, by helping the people of Tibet. And the time has come because Tibet is the soft underbelly of China and it is not a fait accompli. we should question that fait accompli because it harms our national security interest. We just let go of a buffer state by our overtly pacific attitudes, overtly accommodative attitudes of fawning over the newly emerging power, military power of China, and instead of facing up to it, safeguarding our own national interests, we bartered them away. We have paid a price. I think it's about time that we made the costs, raise the costs for China so that it is deterred from its adventurism. How many of us know that for the last 5 years, China has stopped all Indian pilgrims from visiting the most sacred Kailash Mansarovar region. This is the most sacred spot on planet Earth for the Buddhists, for the Hindus, the Jains and the Sikhs. And it just shows the nasty mindset of China that it has stopped this pilgrimage, this tourism. In 1841, General Zorawar Singh had invaded Tibet and he had gone up till the Kailash Mansarovar region and liberated it from the Chinese. He had beaten the Chinese in their own home ground. Maybe we need to repeat that feat. Maybe we need to see that China is edged out of Tibet and there is a buffer between two nuclear armed powers. That buffer was historically a part of our national security calculus. We very foolishly bartered it away for nothing. To the contrary, we gave China the UN Security Council seat, which it has striven strenuously to deny the same to us. China's hostile stance is patently obvious. No amount of sweet talk, no amount of diplomatic subterfuge and niceties can cover the harm that China is trying to inflict upon India. China is doing everything to prevent India from emerging as a significant power in its own right. We will have to defend our own national interest, and for that it is time to play the Tibet card. Thank you. Please like and support the Chanakya dialogues and also the On Target program.